The Bible's a huge book. It's long, and sometimes it's really complicated. And so how do you remember sort of the entire story of the Scriptures? How do you get a bird's eye view to sort of see the big picture of the Bible? Well, what I've discovered is you can use the stages of a person's development as kind of a mnemonic device to help you remember things that were going on in different stages of Israel's history. Let me show you. One way to understand what the Bible is that it's a religious and spiritual history of the ancient Israelites. And so, as I look at their story, I notice that it can kind of match up to the way that a person grows up, and that they as a nation sort of had stages or phases of life that they went through. And so my thinking is that if you can remember these stages of a person's life, it'll help you remember what was going on in the spiritual and religious history of Israel. So let's talk about that word, Israel. Do you remember where it comes from? There's a story in the book of Genesis about Jacob, who is Abraham and Sarah's grandson. And he has inherited this big task, this vision quest that God has given to Abraham and Sarah. That they are going to be a people, their descendants are going to be a people who bless all the nations of the earth. And this is a huge deal. And so Jacob is really concerned about having blessing, right? Because he's got to be able to give it to other people. And so he ends up stealing it from his brother. And it doesn't really feel legitimate to him. So there's this event, this occurrence that's mysterious where he encounters this man and they fight all night. And in the morning, the man gives up and tells Jacob to let him go. And Jacob says to him, I'm not going to let you go until I get your blessing. And it's there we learn that this man, this mysterious man, was either God or an angel or something, right, like God. And this is where he gives Jacob his blessing and then gives him this name, he who wrestles with God. So Israel is the name of a person, right? It was Jacob, Abraham and Sarah's grandson. But it's more than that. It also is a place where Abraham's descendants settled. It's a race of people. It's an ethnicity. You can be an Israelite. But it's also a religion. You can be born a completely different ethnicity and convert to Judaism. So when you study the Bible, you're really studying the spiritual and religious history of the ancient Israelites. And it's not just one thing. It's multiple things. As we sometimes say, it's complicated. And that's why looking at it as a sort of developmental thing, things that it changes and grows over stages and periods of life, is helpful in remembering the story. So Israel was started. It was born when God came to Abraham and to Sarah and said, I'm going to start a family and a culture through you, and through your descendants, all the nations of the earth will be blessed. And so I call that stage the infancy, because Judaism was born. And you may recall what God told Abraham and Sarah. He said, I'm going to make you a great nation, and through your descendants, all the families of the earth will be blessed. I often call this the vision quest that God gave to Abraham and Sarah. But if Abraham and Sarah are the birth of Judaism, they are not the first thing that happens in the Bible. In fact, that call to Abraham and Sarah comes in Genesis chapter 12. And so you've got Genesis 1 through 11 are a whole bunch of things that have happened before Abraham and Sarah actually come onto the scene. These are sometimes called the mythopoetic stories. It's the story of creation, the Garden of Eden, the fall of humanity, Noah and the flood, the Tower of Babel. In these stories, there is something that goes wrong. Human beings disobey God, and the relationship with God is broken. And so when Abraham and Sarah come on the scene, and he says, I'm going to make you this great nation, and all the people of the earth are going to be blessed. In many ways, God was saying that Abraham and Sarah were like an answer to the problem that was created in the Garden of Eden. So in many ways, you could think of it as those early stories being God conceiving of how to solve the problem. And so I call that the conception stage. And just like a baby forming in a mama's belly is kind of a mysterious thing, these stories are also mysterious. These creation, these origin stories. And so I call Genesis 1 through 11 the conception stage. God conceived of a plan of how to bring humanity back to him after they fell in the Garden of Eden. And then Abraham and Sarah, again, they were called, and so Judaism is born. And through them, their descendants, their culture, their family would be a group of people who would bless all the people of the earth. And this is where the theme of our class comes from, blessed to bless. And that moves us into the next phase, childhood. What I mostly mean by this is, just like an infant is really tiny, it grows, it gets bigger, and so it becomes a child. And so those stories in Genesis 12 through 50 really are this childhood phase where they grow in size. Abraham and Sarah have Isaac and Ishmael. Isaac and Rebekah have Jacob and Esau. Jacob marries his two cousins, Rachel and Leah, and then he also has kids with their slave girls, Bilhah and Zilpah. And they just get bigger. So if Abraham and Sarah are this little tribe of kinsmen, about 50 people, then eventually with Isaac and Rebekah and Jacob and Rachel, they grow to a tribe. And then they eventually follow Joseph down to Egypt, and that's where they become much bigger. So that's why I call this the childhood phase, because it makes you think, oh, this is where they got a little bit bigger with all those kids and grandkids. So they go from the infancy stage, where they're just getting started, just being born, and then to the childhood stage, where they grow in size just a little bit. And that leads us to the teenage phase. Now, I call this the teenage phase for a lot of different reasons. One reason is this. By the time they get down to Egypt, and they're there as slaves for about 400 years, they have grown to full size, just like a teenager is sometimes as big as an adult, and yet they're not really an adult. The same is true for Israel. They were full size by this point. They were hundreds of thousands of them, but they didn't really fully know who they were yet. Sort of like a teenager, right? You sort of have 1 foot in childhood and 1 foot in adulthood. They were still growing as a people. I also call this the teenage years because stereotypically, teenagers sometimes can be kind of rebellious. They can be kind of moody. And this is sort of where they were at. And so just like a teenager needs rules, God gave them, at this point in their history, some rules. Right? He gives them the 10 Commandments, but he also gives them this expanded set of rules, the 613 guidelines or laws of the halakha, or the pathway. And it's during this period where they wander in the wilderness for 40 years, and sometimes being a teenager can feel like that, sort of like you're in an in-between phase in life. And so I call these the teenage years. And you can kind of recall those stories, Moses arguing with people in Exodus, same thing in the book of Numbers, that really is a struggle between Moses, who's kind of like their dad. Moses and God are like their dad and mom at the time, and Israel is sort of like a rebellious teenager. So reviewing, again, Israel is born with the covenant of Abraham and Sarah. They get a little bit bigger in size with their grandson Jacob and Rachel and Leah, Bilhah and Zilpah, move down to Egypt. And then in Egypt is where they become fully grown, but they're not quite there yet, sort of the teenage phase. They're a young nation trying to figure out who they are. And that leads us to one of the most complicated periods of Israel's history, what I call the young adult years. Now, when you think of a young adult, what do you think of? Right? Someone who's in college, right? Maybe they're dating around. They don't quite know what they're going to do for a living. They're maybe going out with friends, living in an apartment with a bunch of friends. So there's aspects of that can help you remember this period of their history. I sometimes call this the Justin Bieber, Miley Cyrus phase of Israel's history. And by that I mean that Justin Bieber and Miley Cyrus, they really are good people, and they want to do good things, but they also sometimes tend to get off the rails. And that really does capture this period of Israel's history in the Bible. If you remember in class, we called this the worst book ever. And it's the story of how when there was a good judge or a good leader, things started to go well for Israel. But then there would be this judge who would be horrible, and things would just completely tank. The Bible says that in those days Israel had no king, and everybody did what was right in their own eyes. You've got the story of Samson, the anti-hero. And then, to be quite honest, there's stories in that book that we just skipped because they're just horrible. The book of Judges is trying to say that this was a period of their history when sometimes they got it right, but a lot of times they got it wrong. But it was a time when they were going back up into the land of Canaan. They were trying to take that piece of land back. And if you call the young adult years kind of a time of selfishness, maybe that was good for that time in their history when they were military conquerors and trying to take that land back. But it was sort of a mixed time for them. So to review, they've got Abraham and Sarah. They've got this vision quest of becoming this culture. They grow a little bit bigger with their son Isaac and their grandson Jacob and his family. They become fully grown as sort of a nation in Egypt. Call this the teenage years because they're sort of struggling in the wilderness period. And then these young adult years when it's very much up and down in their relationship to God. And that leads us to the next phase, the settling down period. This is a time in your life usually when you decide you want to get married. You pick a career. Sometimes after you get married and get a job, you sort of choose a city that you're going to live in. You buy a house. You have kids. You really try to figure out who am I as a person, and you just settle into being that person. And in many ways, that fits this period of their history. This was a time when they really came into their national and religious identity. They did change their form of government. They went from a theocracy and a system of judges to a monarchy. King Saul was their first king, but he was kind of a disaster. And then David rises to power, and David becomes the symbol of stability and sort of national strength. He chooses Jerusalem to be the capital city. He passes a law that people need to come to Jerusalem to make sacrifices. He does that to try to bring them together as a people. And they really, at this point in their history, they finally take possession of that land, and they can begin to spend their money and their energies on other things. David wants to build a temple for God after he establishes Jerusalem as the center, but God tells him that's going to be a task for his son Solomon, and he does that. So think about this. You've gone from this really small group of people, Abraham and Sarah and his kinsmen. That family grows a little bit bigger under his grandson Jacob and his wives and their sons. They move down to Egypt, and they sort of grow in size. It's in Egypt where they really expand in number. They become this fully sized nation, but it's still kind of an in-between time. There's some rebellion. They need some structure. They finally begin to move back up into the land of Canaan to take back that land, but that is a really kind of up and down, inconsistent period of their history, trying to figure out who they are, sometimes being selfish. And then finally, they kind of figure out who they are, and they're settling into their national identity. They pick a capital city. They build a house, so to speak, with the temple. And they kind of are figuring out who they are. So now they can finally get to the task of living out this vision quest that God gave Abraham and Sarah of being a nation who will bless all the people of the earth. Right? Wrong. Now, Solomon is known as the wisest person in the Bible. And to be fair, he certainly started out that way. And the wisdom writings are attributed to him and likely to his advisors during his reign. But that all tanked eventually. The power and the money, it really corrupted him. Solomon is considered in many ways kind of the reincarnation of Pharaoh. The Bible says that he married 700 wives and that he had 300 concubines. Now, a concubine, if you recall, was essentially a female slave, right? And this is horrible. I mean, it's misogynistic, it's abusive to women. And if that isn't bad enough, it also says that these women were women who practiced religions that were fertility cults. And what that means is that their worship was rooted in sexual practice. And that Solomon allowed these wives of his to build temples in Israel and Judah, and that he let them combine or mix these fertility religions with Judaism. This was like the worst kind of syncretism. And it's this point that the country really begins to break up. And eventually, after Solomon's reign, it splits right down the middle and divides. It does the exact opposite of what his father David was trying to create. So just when things were beginning to get good, Solomon sort of turns it in the other direction. And so look at the stages, right? I'm not going to go through them all again, but look at what is going on. They finally grow into their spiritual identity as God's people and begin to get stable and settled and unified in that. Solomon wrecks it. And this leads us to a stage that I call the wisdom years, because it's going to introduce the prophets. And the prophets are these people who are going to come and try to help get them back on track. So if you see King Solomon as kind of like, the dad who decides to cheat on God, right, the midlife crisis, then one way to remember who the prophets were is they're kind of like family therapists. They're doing an intervention. They're going to Israel and saying, look, if you want to bring health back into your nation, then you need to recommit yourself to your life in God. You need to quit being unfair to the poor, and you need to care for the needy and start doing what's right. And this is going to get you back to where you need to be to become that people who are going to be, the kingdom of priests that bless all the people on earth. It started with Elijah and Elisha. Eventually, it's going to include the other prophets that we read about in the scriptures. And as I said to you, the nation split into two, and any of the prophets in this period are either preaching to the kings in the north or kings in the south, trying to get them back on track with God. So the prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, the four major prophets, and then the minor prophets, Joel, Amos, Obadiah, Jonah, Micah, Nahum, Habakkuk, Zephaniah, Haggai, Zechariah, Malachi. Any of those prophets, when you look at their story, they are preaching to either one of two places. They're preaching to kings in the north or kings in the south, because the kingdom has split. And their message is basically the same. You need to come back to God. You need to care for the poor and the needy, start doing the right thing, and get back on track. Now, one of the peculiar parts of their message was this, that God is going to allow these foreign countries around you to invade you, to occupy you, and to take you as captives, as slaves, into exile. And it was a peculiar message. I mean, you can imagine that the kings in the north, in Israel, and the kings in the south, didn't care for this message at all. But this is part of what the prophets were saying, is God is getting their attention by allowing them to be captive by foreign powers. This period is characterized by three major occupations, or three major captivities. It started with Assyria in the north, and then eventually Babylon. They attacked from the east, and that's King Nebuchadnezzar. He marches into Jerusalem. He burns the temple to the ground, and he takes the smartest and most accomplished citizens, particularly the young ones, takes them into captivity. And then eventually Persia conquers Babylon. I often call this ABP, always be positive, as a way of remembering these three captivities. But I say always be positive because the P, positive, is the Persians. And they were the occupiers who actually allowed those captive Jews to return back home to Jerusalem and rebuild the city and the temple. And then you also see there the Greeks under Alexander the Great, or the Seleucids, who conquered the region in 312 BC, and then eventually the Romans came in as occupiers in 63 BC. And the Romans are what most of us, even if we don't know much about religion, associate with the emergence of Christianity. Now, one of the big messages of the prophets during this period of captivity and exile was that eventually a king, sort of the perfect version of David, would emerge. And this king would be someone who would conquer whatever occupier was, controlling them at the time, and give Israel, their country, back to them, let them reign, and that they would eventually, finally, be able to live out that vision quest of Abraham and Sarah, that they would be this great nation that would bless all the people of the earth. And so they waited, they anticipated, they expected for hundreds of years this coming king, this Messiah that would come and reign. Now, Christians believe that Jesus, when he arrived during the Roman occupation, was this Messiah that has come, whereas modern-day Jews believe that this Messiah is still yet to appear. So there it is. That's a sketch of 4,000 years of history, from the creation stories to the call of Abraham and Sarah, to growing as a nation from a tribe to a nation in Egypt. And then they had that existence in the Exodus and the wilderness, where they're given law and they grow as a people. They eventually move back up into the land of Canaan, where they used to live when they were a tribe, and they have to have the conquest of Canaan. Once they finally get there, they establish this monarchy. The peak of that is David, but that is eventually wrecked under Solomon. The kingdom divides. They're invaded by foreign powers. They are taken captive, and the prophets come and try to get them back on track. And as part of that, they promise the coming of this super king who will bring them back into power and into health. My thinking here is that if you take these stages of human life, that they will help you remember. You'll sort of associate, this is what happens, in your teenage years, and that makes me think of them when they were in the wilderness and after Moses had freed them from Egypt. That's the kind of thing. This part on the right, that's just there to help you kind of remember, or to trigger your memory about what you studied in the Bible on the left. What you see here is, in some ways, a simpler version without the stages of life. It's just the order of the Bible. The creation, Abraham and Sarah, the Exodus, the period of the judges and the conquest, the monarchy and David the king, Solomon's fall, the division, the exiles, and the emergence of Christianity. And so to wrap up, to go back to the beginning, is there a theme to the Bible? If this is a bird's eye view, do you see a theme occurring in the Bible? Christians believe that there is, and it's this, that God is repairing what was broken in the Garden of Eden by blessing a certain culture whose purpose eventually will be to bless all the people on the earth. And that culture, they wrestled with God, they struggled with God in order to become a culture that could eventually bless others. It's a long and winding road, to be sure, but it is eventually resolved in the coming of Jesus. God will bless all the nations, all the people of the earth, through Jesus, who descended from the family of Abraham and Sarah, and is the universal answer to that original vision quest. Jesus is the promised King of Israel, but God opens the blessing up to all the nations, regardless of ethnicity, culture, and race. God blessed Israel so that all the people of the earth could have access to Jesus. And Jesus, as Christians understand him, is God in human form. And so in that sense, everybody has access to God. Jesus is the universalization of God's blessing. With Jesus, everybody has access to God. So, the story of Israel, right? Think about the stages of human life and ask yourself, In each of those stages, there's something about that stage that will help me remember what was going on in the life of Israel. And that will give you a bird's eye view of the entire history of the scriptures, starting with creation, Abraham, and going all the way to the emergence of Jesus and the beginning of Christianity.